Okay, for chapter 17, you're going to be reading about religion, politics, and balance of power in Western Eurasia, which is both Europe and Asia. So there are a couple of big topics in this chapter. Okay, and if you take a look at, for example, the some of the learning objectives for this chapter, one of the first things you're going to run across are the two major Islamic empires that we'll discuss in this chapter, the Ottomans and the Safavids. So one of the first parts of the chapter, one of the first parts of your reading deals with the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids, and you're going to kind of run through both of those empires as you do your reading. The book then jumps back to Europe, and we'll take a look at the Habsburgs and the religious divisions that are developing in France and England as a result of the Reformation, which you read about in the last chapter. And you'll finish up talking about about Russia and the balance of power. Okay, and that's how this chapter kind of goes. The most important thing, and probably if you look at the map here, the most important things that you'll be dealing with early in the chapter, like I said, are the Ottomans, which are right here. The Ottoman Empire is a large empire when we kind of run into it. It not only is in what is the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, which is right there, but it also has expanded into northern Africa. It has pushed eastward to the border of the Safavid Empire, the other empire that we'll talk about. And it has even pushed up into what is today southeastern Europe, and is pushing its way all the way up into what is today modern day Austria. So you'll read about the Ottomans and how they are developing, and they are a big empire. Right next to them is the Safavids, and their homeland is modern day Iran. The Islam that is practiced in the Ottoman Empire is different than the Islam that is practiced in the Safavid. So they're both Islamic empires, but there is a pretty big difference between the two. When you get to the Ottoman Empire in about 1500 or so, you'll kind of read about this during during the chapter, that the Ottoman Empire is centered in what used to be Constantinople. It will eventually be, once it is conquered in 1453, it will be eventually renamed as what it is today, Istanbul. The Ottoman Empire has expanded, and you guys can see that it includes modern-day Palestine, Syria, Egypt, modern-day Iraq, most of modern-day Hungary, which is in, of course, southeastern Europe, and so is Greece, okay, and all of the coast pretty much of North Africa. The Ottomans were a very powerful military state. They in these areas that they conquered, they tended to bring back, especially in southeastern Europe, they would bring back conquered Christian children, convert them to Islam, and those would become the in America, and well, in Western civilization, they get, this term gets anglicized in the Janissaries, but really in the Ottoman Empire they were the Janissary. But anyway, the Janissaries are converted to Islam, raised as soldiers, and became really part of the elites in Ottoman society. They were highly trusted. They were devoted to the Ottoman Emperor, and they were extremely well-trained, well-educated, and a very, very big part of the Ottoman Empire. Here you can see how they were dressed, okay, and they were really the elite. They were not only elite militarily, but they were also the elite in a lot of Ottoman society as well. At its height, the Ottoman Empire controlled really the some of the major religious cities in the world. They controlled Mecca, they controlled Medina, which are the two really holiest cities for the Islamic world, but also Jerusalem. And yes, Jerusalem is a holy city to Islam as well. The Dome of the Rock, the Temple of, or the mosque at the Dome of the Rock is very important to Muslims as well. They're all pilgrimage sites. They are all very important. The the Ottomans tended to be fairly cosmopolitan. They a lot of these areas they controlled, they were very diverse areas. Constantinople was a very diverse area before the Ottomans got in control of it. So the Ottoman Empire, inside the Ottoman Empire, you had Muslims, you had Christians, you had Jews, you had really people that were still polytheistic. So they had to find a way to manage this, and the sultans, the Ottoman emperors, the sultans oftentimes found a way to manage this and manage it effectively. They don't really enforce a kind of a single idea. Okay, one of the great things that Sultan Suleiman did, for example, was don't try to make everyone conform to Islamic law. So essentially, what he did, and this was a tradition inside of Islam anyway, is to allow Christians, Jews, others to practice their religion as they always had. They just had to pay taxes. Essentially, they had to pay tax to keep themselves free to where they could worship on their own. So, and that is really one of the things that made them really able to survive for such a long period of time. The other thing is that the Ottoman Empire tended to trend towards Europe, okay, and in fact had already invaded parts of Europe, and especially in southeastern Europe. And so they tended to embrace more technology. They tended to embrace more trade with Europe. And when they did that, that allowed them to diversify economically and to use these new technologies to help them conquer these areas and expand. In 1529, the Ottoman Empire had pushed all the way up to Vienna before they were turned back by the Austrians. Now, eventually, all right, the Ottoman Empire settles down, and it will eventually sort of be pushed out of southeastern Europe, but it's going to survive really intact as an empire until you get to really the eve of World War One. Okay, so they're going to survive for another 300 years. So be aware of that. Next to the Ottoman Empire, you'll find Safavid Iran, which is right next door, just to the east of the Ottomans. And the Safavids are a little bit different. Okay, one of the things that you'll notice right from the get-go is that they practice a different form of Islam. They are Shiites, and so they are a different sort of form of Muslim worship. Okay, it's been around since almost really the beginnings of Islam, but it's a little bit different. The Safavid dynasty is technically where Persia was. The Safavids conquered Persia in the 1600s under the leadership of Shah Ismail. They were in a great trading location. They're really on the crossroads of trade between the East, all right, China, India, and those areas, and the Ottoman Empire in Europe. So goods flowed through this area and over the overland trade. They were they did things a little bit differently than the Ottomans did. They were much harsher. They believed that they sort of forced everyone into their Shiite beliefs. Okay, and they sometimes even attacked the Ottoman Empire because of their differences in opinion about Islam. So there's always, it seems to be, a border war going on between the Ottomans and the Safavids. The At the height of the Safavid Empire, you're talking about as kind of you can see here about 500,000 people in Isfahan. It is a beautiful city. It has tons of irrigation, gardens, mosaic work. Okay, and at its height, really, the Safavid Empire benefited from being really not only able to bring in artisans, craftsmen, ideas from the east, but they also could export things to the west. One of the most important exports was carpets. Okay, Persian rugs, which you all have heard of and are in high demand and extremely expensive. After about the middle of the 1600s, though, the Safavids will begin to collapse. When I told you guys the Ottomans really managed to survive, the Safavids collapse, and Shah Abbas's successors are just terrible, and eventually Iran will be invaded, and the Safavid Empire collapses. This pretty much leaves the Ottomans as the major Muslim territory, the major Muslim empire. Okay. And remember, we talked about how the Ottomans have tried to move into southeastern Europe and have been turned away by the Austrians on several occasions. And after that, really, as you got into really about the middle of the 1700s, the Ottomans began to shrink back into their borders and became less aggressive and more defensive. And they sort of began to sort of really protect their borders, and you don't see them out being extremely aggressive anymore. And this is really what allows them to survive until the beginnings of World War One. The one of the things the chapter will introduce you to is Sufism, okay, which is a new form or a new really religious path. Okay, it's kind of a mixture of some of the mystical religions that you would find in that area in Islam. Okay, so it's a mixture, and you can read about that. The next big jump that the textbook takes is you learn about, since we've already made contact with Austria, you learn about the Habsburgs. Okay, the Habsburg dynasty is one of the most important dynasties in Europe. Okay, and the Habsburgs would start out really being part of the being part of the old Holy Roman Empire. Okay, the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, would eventually be divided up as a result of the Reformation. So here's the old Holy Roman Empire here. And the Habsburgs really are going to become better known as the rulers of Austria. Okay. Now, also, you're going to have Habsburgs that will take the control of various thrones or be married into various thrones across Europe. One of those is the Spanish throne. Okay. You'll have Habsburg influence in the Netherlands. Okay, because of the Dutch trade and various things that are going on there. The next thing that you kind of get into is the 30 Years' War, the last major religious war that goes on in Europe. So make sure that you, as you do your reading, that you take some notes about the 30 Years' War and its importance. The important thing to kind of remember is, as a result of the Reformation, as a result of Martin Luther breaking away from the Catholic Church in Germany, the Reformation began to spread. It spreads into France, and followers of a breakaway teacher named John Calvin would bring Protestantism to France, and you have the beginnings of Protestantism in France. French Protestants are called Huguenots, and you can see that right there. It's their name for one of the gates in Paris that they used to meet at secretly. because they're persecuted. And France is dominantly Catholic, and they will be persecuted all the way up until about 1598, when they were finally given limited toleration by King Henry. So St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 saw many French Protestants massacred by Catholics in France. So one of the things that most people don't realize about the Reformation is that you do have this split between Protestantism and Catholicism, but you also have a lot of religious conflict in Europe as a result, with those two sides fighting each other. Okay, the textbook is here kind of setting up something. Okay, and to go along with a lot of this religious conflict that's going on, the textbook is also setting up what's going to happen in France, which is the beginning of absolute monarchy. Louis the 15th, or excuse me, Louis the 14th Louis the 14th is always considered to be the perfect absolute monarch. But it takes France a while to get there. Okay, Louis the 14th's father, Louis the 13th, really didn't really care that much about being king. He loved being king, but he pretty much turned over the reins of government to a prime minister named Cardinal Richelieu. And Richelieu really ran France in the name of Louis the 13th for years. But once Louis the 14th becomes king, then you're going to see this change a little bit. Louis the 14th is going to become the most powerful monarch in Europe, and we will characterize him as being absolute. Okay, absolute monarchy means total, complete. And so Louis basically, when he becomes old enough to rule France in about 1648 or so by himself, then Louis is large and in charge. He dominates the military. He is in control of taxes. He's in control of spending. He's dominates the nobility, forces them to come and live with him. Okay, so Louis is what we would consider to be one of the best examples of a new governmental structure that's emerging in Europe, royal absolutism, or sometimes it's just called absolute monarchy. So Louis is our best example of that. It will spread into other parts of Europe. And let's face it, if you're a king, okay, everybody wants to be a king like Louis. Everybody wants to have as much power as Louis does. So he becomes a model for the rest of Europe to try to follow. On the flip side of that, okay, while most of Europe is trying to become absolute, in England you also have a situation developing. Okay, in England will become part of the Protestant Reformation as well. Elizabeth's father, okay, Queen Elizabeth I, her father Henry VIII, had been a part of the Reformation because he had created a Protestant church and forced England to become a part of the Protestant Reformation. Now, the reason that Henry did this is he did not have a religious experience. Henry did this because he was obsessed with the idea of having a male child. And the only way that he could do that was to get a divorce from his first wife, Catherine, who was a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. And the Catholic Church frowns on divorce, doesn't allow it. And so the only way that Henry could have divorced his first wife was to take England out of the Catholic Church and put them into a new type and a new religious organization, and that becomes the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Henry's successors, with the exception of his oldest daughter, Mary, who was a daughter of Catherine and did try to, for a time, try to take England back into the Catholic Church, Henry's children will try to cement England being a Protestant country. And of course, Henry's most famous offspring is Elizabeth, who will rule England for 45 years. She will turn back an attempt by the Spanish to invade England in 1588, and she will become one of England's most powerful and most well-loved monarchs. She is the one that not only really turns England into a very powerful state. By turning back the Spanish attempt to invade England in 1588, she really weakened Spain. And she really is the patron of English exploration. English exploration here into America begins under Elizabeth. Nothing permanent is established until her successor becomes king, when the first permanent English settlement is established in Jamestown. But we see the beginnings really of English exploration during Elizabeth's reign. So England is part of this transformation and reformation religiously as well. But it is also opposite from what's going on in France, because England has a long tradition of having a parliament, having a representative body. And that tradition dates all the way back into the 1300s. The tradition of limiting the power of the king in England goes all the way back to the 1200s in the Magna Carta. So this is a very different situation. Even though many monarchs are going to try to emulate what Louis XIV is doing in France, some English monarchs are even going to do that as well. And it's not going to go well. And as a result, you're actually going to have to two really separate incidents in England where the English reject absolute monarchy. The first comes under Elizabeth's, well, really grandson, Charles I, who he really gets England involved in several wars, and he always had to go to Parliament to get permission to fight and to raise money, and Charles hates it. And so he tries to dismiss Parliament, tries to get rid of it, all right, and what it leads to is a civil war. From 1642 to 1649, England fights a civil war between Parliament and the king. So Parliament's forces were led by a Puritan leader named Oliver Cromwell, who will defeat Charles's forces in 1649. Charles is executed in early 1649, and from 1649 until 1660, England is essentially ruled over by Parliament. It doesn't have a monarch. So see how different that is when we talk about that in France, you have the beginnings of royal absolutism. In England, the English are trying to reject absolutism. In 1660, they bring back the monarchy, though. And for a while, it seems like the English monarchy is back into the good graces of Parliament again, and everything seems to be going along. But in 1688, things have gone bad again, thanks to James II, who has become king. He is terribly ill-suited to be the king of England. He is very Catholic. He believes in absolute monarchy. And so rather than fight another civil war, in 1689, they boot James, or in 1688, I'm sorry, they boot James off of the throne in what's called the Glorious Revolution. And they invite King William from the Netherlands and his wife, Queen Mary, who's one of James's daughters, to invade England and take control of England, which they do. So James is booted off the throne in 1688, replaced by William and Mary. William and Mary in 1689 signed the Bill of Rights. And from 1689 on, England, even till today, England is a constitutional monarchy. Okay? So England rejects royal absolutism. All right? France embraces it under Louis XIV. And most of Europe will too, with the exception, really, of England. So make sure that you understand the differences between those two major governments. The rest of the chapter, you'll talk a little bit about the the rise of the Russian Empire. Make sure that you read about Peter the Great, who will stage really a revolution in sorts, trying to make Russia more modern. He embraces Western culture, encourages Russians to shave their beards, to dress more Western, to dress more modern. All right. He will even build a palace similar to what you would see in France for Louis XIV in Versailles. And so you get to kind of see Peter try to build a more modern Russia and a more modern monarchy. The kind of the last part of the chapter, you'll talk a little bit about Prussia, Habsburg Austria, which we already talked about. And so really you come out of this sort of looking with Europe, looking like this, okay? In the early 1700s, this is what Europe looks like. You got France, you got England up here. This is the Holy Roman Empire, okay, which is going to eventually become Germany. But there's a couple of states that are really emerging. Brandenburg, Prussia right here, which will eventually be the state that unifies Germany. Austria over here. We've already talked about the Ottoman Empire over here. And so you can sort of see what Europe looks like during this time period. A lot of stuff going on in this chapter. Okay, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the importance of the Habsburgs, the development of absolute monarchy, the development of constitutional monarchy, the influence of the Reformation. All right, so make sure that you, as you go through this chapter, that you take those notes necessary to keep all of this stuff straight.